Welcome to Rome. This is The Bittersweet Life with Katie Sewell and Tiffany Parks. Hello, this is The Bittersweet Life. I'm Katie Sewell, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Recently, I had the privilege and honor of speaking with David Epstein. David Epstein is the author of a number of New York Times bestsellers, including Range and The Sports Gene. His latest book is called Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better. He and I met at Town Hall Seattle and had a conversation in front of a live studio audience. Can you call it a live studio audience if it's a performance venue? I'd like to think so in this case. Town Hall is, of course, the producer of the conversation you're about to hear, and they were the ones that made the audio recording. And so it is with my great thanks to Town Hall for letting me share this conversation with David Epstein about constraints with you, the audience of The Bittersweet Life. For those of you who have been here for a long time, you might remember that Town Hall Seattle is a performance venue here in town where I used to work as the program director. And if you go back a number of years, you'll find a lot of great author interviews that I did during my time there. And this is one of those as well. I think you're going to be fascinated by this conversation. And I would bet you money that something you hear, you will share with somebody else in your life after you hear it. And if you really love it, and this goes for any of the broadcasts of The Bittersweet Life, please share it with people you know. If this is a memorable conversation or one where you say, oh my gosh, you would not believe what I heard today, or I really enjoyed this, don't keep the show a secret. Tell your friends. Make a post about it on social media. Help us spread the word and keep this show growing and thriving for the year to come. All right, thank you so much, and enjoy this conversation with David Epstein. Thanks everyone for coming. This is a great book that's full of so many great things, and we're only going to scratch the surface. As you can see, I might have marked it up a bit while I was reading it. Highly recommend. But I want to start with, if there's one thing, David, that we believe in the United States, it is freedom. Freedom of choice, freedom to live as we want, to think what we want, and we have a lot of choices these days. I mean, when it comes to streaming options alone, we have so many choices. And I think one of the fundamental questions in this book is, what is the problem of having so much freedom?
Well, let me start since you mentioned streaming choices.
Yeah.
Since the introduction of infinite scrolling, international surveys show that people have been getting progressively more bored. And in research that psychologists did to try to understand why, they gave people lots of different videos that they could look at. And if they gave people, say, 20 videos and said, find whatever you like, those people ended up switching a lot and being more bored than if they just took one video from that set of 20 and gave it to them and said, you have to watch this one. And their theory is that just the idea that there's something else you could be doing ruins the experience of the moment itself. And never, I think we can perhaps extrapolate that to all other areas of life now, right? Where historically humans compared themselves to the lives of others in their neighborhood or in their school or at their place of work. And now it's to not only to all of humanity, potentially, on the internet, but to all of humanity plus a huge number of, all of humanity, then all of carefully curated and filtered humanity, and then now all of the fake humanity that's complete. And I think we're just not set up to thrive in that kind of infinite comparison mode. And so the idea that we'll always be better off with more choices, which is sort of how humans are modeled in neoclassical economic theory, turns out not to be correct.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. Well, one thing you're right is that total freedom can lead us to default thinking along the path of least resistance. So what does that mean, and why does that happen?
Yeah, so as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham likes to say, you may think your brain is made for thinking, but it's actually made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible, because thinking is energetically costly. And so you'll, when given just sort of an open field or a blank slate, you'll default to things that are convenient or what cognitive scientists call the path of least resistance, right? You'll go down something that's familiar or convenient to you. And so if you actually want to grow or be creative or things like that, you actually have to have that convenient solution blocked, or else you'll only do things that are easy. And I think there's some ominous signs about this, by the way. There was this MIT, we're kind of seeing now the first generation of research on how some AI tools affect cognition for like students and things like that. And it's still early days, so don't want to be too absolute. But MIT did this interesting study where they had students, they had them write essays on certain topics, and some of them could use ChatGPT and some of them couldn't. And then they were brought back a month later, to their surprise, and asked to write essays on the same topics again. And this time the group that had access to ChatGPT didn't have access, and the group that didn't have access did. And the group that started with ChatGPT remembered nothing of what they had written in their own essays. They learned nothing. Their brain activation was low and all this kind of stuff. Because when you're given these tools, your brain wants to do the easy thing, right? It's like driving around with a GPS. You don't learn your way around, which is fine if you're always going to have GPS. But when it comes to developing our brains for all these other kinds of thinking, if you're allowed to do the easy thing, it's actually quite bad for you. The people who had to use their brain first, though, were okay when they then turned to ChatGPT. So I think the rule is brain first, tool second. You have to like enforce the hard order on yourself.
I remember that because it's almost like different parts of the brain lit up too.
Yeah.
Like where you were thinking even while you were using AI was more lit up if you had not been able to use it first.
Totally, but we're programmed for convenience, and so unless we actually put like restrictions in place, this is what students are going to do.
I mean, it's sort of along the same line. Later on, you indicate that left to our own intuition, we'll tend to avoid learning something new.
Yeah.
Always. And how do we force ourselves to learn? Is it just that we have to always go, well, normally I would do this, so let's do that?
Some of that. I mean, so this all falls under this category of what psychologists call desirable difficulties. These are things that are good for you, but that are frustrating in the short term or hard in the short term. To use the GPS analogy, right, it'd be like trying to get around on your own. And so when it comes to things like creativity, some of what I write about is that the basically the best way to make someone creative, if you give someone just open opportunity. So there's this study I cite early in the book where psychologists did an international survey of creativity myths. Mm-hmm. Right? These are things we know from research are not true. And the most popular one was that people are most creative when they are most free. That was like tied with that brainstorming is a good way to generate lots of diverse ideas. Those were like the two most popular, and we could talk about that too. But because our brains are programmed for this path of least resistance, if you're just given open possibilities, you'll just do something familiar. And so the best creative prompt you can give someone is to have them do the first thing that comes to mind and then say, now you're not allowed to do that. Like whatever it is, whether they're painting, whether they're going into a client meeting saying, if we weren't allowed to propose the thing we always propose, what would we propose instead? And the history of artistic innovation. So there's this psychologist, Patricia Stokes, who studied the history of artistic innovation. And the thread that she found was that these repeated innovators would put constraints on themselves, basically, what she called paired constraints. They would block a known method and then force themselves to replace it with something else. So like Claude Monet was a simple example where he, at the time, painters were using light and dark shades, of course, to portray lightness and darkness, mixing paints with black. And he decided he would use no black whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Like this was so absolute that at his funeral, when there was a black shroud put over his coffin, one of his friends freaked out and started yelling, "No black for Monet," and went and got a floral tablecloth and draped it over his coffin. And he said instead of using black, he's going to use only pure colors, but right next to each other to try to convey any impression of light, which is what gave birth to Impressionism. So the first step in that, Stokes would have called a preclude constraint, where you block the status quo thing, you prevent yourself from using it, and then you define something else that you force yourself to use. And that was the pattern she saw over and over and over again in artistic innovation that she called the paired constraints approach.
I love that. Did you find anything that's like the constraints that are put on you by your inability to do certain things? Like, Claude Monet, as an example, like loses his sight over time and starts to sort of paint in this way that represents sort of how he's seeing the world. what happens when it's like an imposed constraint? Or
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like, I'm a terrible speller, so what am I going to do about it?
Yeah, there are tons of those in artistic innovation. I mean, Jackson Pollock was the worst drawer at the Art Students League, and so he was forced to come up with something with a new language. Vincent van Gogh, when he initially said one should only do figures, people, not nature. And then he realized he wasn't that great at it, and he was like, okay, maybe not that. One of the examples I liked was the novelist Haruki Murakami, who, in his late 20s decided he was going to try to write, and starts writing and realizes his style is very generic, right? Because he's doing just what comes to mind. So in an effort to come up with something else, he starts writing in his very limited English and then reverse translates it back into Japanese because he didn't have a very expansive vocabulary. And that's what led to this kind of, whether you like his books or not, he can be kind of polarizing, but he has this mesmerizing rhythm that he came up with in that way. And the psychologists actually sometimes refer to this as the green eggs and ham effect, because Dr. Seuss famously wrote the book Green Eggs and Ham based on a bet that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. And that forced him to experiment with rhythm and meter in all these ways. And even before that book, actually, he was asked, like, I was reading children's literature at the time. It's so boring before him. It's like Johnny walks to school, Johnny ties his shoe and stuff. And he was asked to write a book using about 200 words from a kid's vocabulary list. And if he looks at the list and he says there's basically no adjectives, so he starts complaining to his wife. He says, it's like trying to make a strudel without any strudels, which I think is like a great Seussian line. And then he decides, he throws up his hands and says, I'm just going to use the first 2 rhyming words in the book and create a story around it. Anybody can guess what the first 2 rhyming words were? Cat and hat, right. And so because he didn't have expansive vocabulary, he had to experiment with this rollicking rhythm and develop his own style. So I kind of think, as I was thinking about this book, I was hoping it sort of might be an emotional reframe for people dealing with limits, whether they're imposed or not, because there can obviously be bad constraints, right? The word is practically synonymous with something that's frustrating. But I think whether they're imposed by you or someone else, they can also be opportunities to clarify priorities and to launch into productive experimentation that you wouldn't have otherwise.
So for you personally, has it taught you to do anything different in researching this topic? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I was like very consciously doing me search with this book, like writing the book that I needed, because I was terrible at all this stuff. So let me just, where to even begin? I mean, I changed so many things about what I do, but let's just start with my writing. I wrote 50% over length for my first 2 books because I didn't define what I was doing very well. So I had to write a book and a half and then cut it back to get a book. I took a trip to Arctic Sweden for my first book that I had to cut. Right? Once I became a parent, I couldn't be taking trips to Arctic Sweden that were not going in the book anymore. And so this time around, I didn't write a word of the book for a year. Only research, interviewing. And I ended up with a 100,000-word note sheet, which I printed out, took to a hermitage at a Franciscan monastery for 2 days, didn't say a word, read it,
for you.
1 page at a time, and at the end said, whatever's in my head, I'm going to force it to go in a 1-page structural outline. And that forced me to prioritize ruthlessly what was going to be in the book and find ways to sort of arrange things to fit as much as I could. And if it's not on that page, it did not go in the book. And this is the first time I wrote to the right length and actually ended up turning it in early. And I think that was because I sort of did that based on a suggestion. An important character in the book is this guy named Tony Fadell, who was the lead designer of the iPod and the co-founder of Nest, and one of the smart thermostat company. And he had been at this company that I talk about that had total freedom and was building the future, and they had no constraints. It became a massive disaster. And he came out of that with, he and a whole generation of creators sort of scarred by that and thinking, okay, we really need boundaries. They're super important. So at Nest, for example, he forced the team to work in a literal box where he made them prototype the packaging before they had a product. He said, if it doesn't fit on this box, then it's not one of our priorities. And he told me that the best advice he gives to entrepreneurs now is to write the press release before they start the project, because it forces them to say, what problem are we trying to solve? And so I did that also, and then did this 1-page exercise and found it's painful. It actually is not nice to do, but it really But I think that's part of the point, is it forces you into this really hard thinking that you wouldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was the same thing in structuring this interview. It's like, you have so many great tidbits. I'm like, well, what are we going to highlight and what are we not going to highlight? So that example you just touched on, the company that had total freedom and completely crashed and burned. Do you want to give a snapshot of that company, since we are in Seattle, which is often a tech company?
Sure. So this company was the first so-called concept IPO ever, where Goldman Sachs took them public with just an idea, not a product. What could go wrong? And they had this incredible vision, where it was founded by 3 former Apple employees, 2 of whom had designed the original Mac, and one of whom, whose job, this guy Mark Peratt, who became the CEO, his job inside of Apple was looking at the future of technology. And he was amazing at that. I read his PhD dissertation while I was doing research, 1976 at Stanford, and on the first page he coins the term information economy. And it was eerie to read because he saw what was coming. You know, not just the promise of technology, but the problems. 1976 in his dissertation, he's talking about the growth of misinformation, rising inequality, all these sorts of things, like problems with copyright for creators. It's crazy to read. And in a notebook in 1989, he draws a schematic of a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons and a touch screen and rectangular apps on it. The internet didn't exist yet. There's only 15% of American households had computers. And he writes on it, remote a phone pewter, right? Like, he saw what was coming. And so this company gets spun out of Apple and creates this huge, because everyone can see that this vision is incredible, they get this huge international consortium of businesses investing in them. They're basically making the iPhone, in 1990. And they have so many partners that their meetings have to start with an antitrust lawyer listing all the things they're not allowed to discuss. And the innovation comes fast and furious. Money pours in, they grow, it expands, all these things. And they have so much talent and so much money that they can do anything. And so they frequently do anything. And I interviewed dozens of former employees there, and I'd say 3/4 of them said some form of, I just couldn't figure out what not to do. And so the project just kept going and growing and growing. And every time someone had a good idea, it got bigger. I think the emblematic interview was with this engineer named Steve Perlman, who was charged with creating a calendar function for this personal communicator they were making. And he writes it to go from 1904 to 2096, and he checks it in and thinks he's done. Then one of the leaders comes to him and says, Steve, somebody might write historical apps that go back far. You got to make this thing bigger. So he opens it up and writes it to go from year 1. Then checks it in again. Then another team comes to him and says, Steve, why are you starting with this arbitrary religious context? You got to make this thing go back to the beginning of astronomical time. So he opens it up again and writes the calendar app to start at the Big Bang. And as he said, if he had left it from 1904 to 2096, it would have been 4 lines of code. And instead it dragged on for months. And that's how everything worked there. And when the device finally appeared years late, it shipped with a 200-page manual, and they said their customer was Joe Sixpack, but they never really defined who that was. And so there was no clear problem they were solving. Meanwhile, there were people internally who were biting off much smaller pieces. Like one low-level service engineer who started a website that was connecting, called Auction Web, that was connecting strangers for auctions. And General Magic owned the IP of they had a right to any IP developed by an employee. So he went to the general counsel and the CFO and said, look, this is facilitating commerce between strangers. Isn't that what we want to do? No, go away. Like, we have a much bigger vision. So he left with that site, and then he renamed it eBay. So they had that internally. They had the Palm Pilot internally, but all these things were too small for them. And so they kept growing and became a complete disaster and failure. But the people that came out of there had these lessons about how to put boundaries around work and built things. I mean, Android, iPhone, iPod, LinkedIn, eBay, Nest, Google Maps, things that all of us use every day.
So in that way, did it need to happen? Like, did General Magic, that was what they were called, right?
It's a good question, yeah, General Magic.
That's what it took for them to create all this innovation? I
think it was a success in that way, in that it so deeply scarred the people that worked there. I mean, it ruined a lot of lives in the process, so I don't,
True.
But it so deeply scarred them that they took these lessons out about how to control projects, basically.
So taking a slight detour, like what does creativity have to do with originality?
Yeah, so I got interested in this. There's this whole chapter about this, and the idea that creativity and originality are synonymous. When I was like reading in history about this, it was not even a thing until basically the late 18th century, where the Romantic period, where they were kind of rebelling against the Enlightenment and logic and all these things. And there was a movement within the Romantic period that wanted to sort of imbue humans with more genius. And so they started this thing called the cult of the hero and all this stuff, where they started marketing the idea that creatives are just like struck by lightning, that just like comes out of nowhere, and inspiration is these like lightning strikes. But that wasn't really an idea before that. So, like as I was going back through Shakespeare's work, Shakespeare did some things that now we would call plagiarism. Mm-hmm. For sure. But that was not a problem, because in his time, creativity was really viewed as taking something that the audience already understood and making it your own, like a musician who covers a song but makes it their own, because then the audience had a basis in understanding what was there and could evaluate the ways that you tweaked it and changed it. And that, in fact, is how most impactful, whether it's artistic works or works of engineering, that they're actually, if they want to make an impact, if you want to make an impact, they have to be grounded in stuff that people already understand. That's why like the first electric cars had you plug in a thing that looks like a gas hose into a place where there's a non-existent gas tank anymore. Or why you have folders on your computer, it's called skeuomorphic design. You're supposed to indicate to you from its design what it's supposed to do. And the more new the idea is, the more grounded in something familiar it should be. So if anybody's ever read that probably the most famous ever book on screenwriting called Story by Robert McKee, one of the fun things he notes is that fantasy movies have the most traditional plots, because the crazier the setting is, the more traditional, it has what's called arch plot, basically the hero's journey, the more familiar the plot has to be. So if you want something to have an impact, you really want to have this balance between familiarity and originality. Mm-hmm. And like the one of the major through lines in that chapter is about Martin Luther King Jr.'s repurposing of material, where he would hitch his radical ideas onto the most familiar things for the audience imaginable, basically. And sometimes that meant he copied also, where he got in trouble for that in the academic setting. But that's not where his most important work was happening. And so he made sure to understand what the audience already completely believed and took as like a undeniable truth, and then would take that and then would attach his radical ideas to it to gain their acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that part was fascinating. Okay, I'm going to jump all around because we're going to come up on the Q&A portion, and I want to hit on a couple other topics first.
I can be more...
No, you're perfect. You talk about lots of different parameters that people set on themselves. Like one is called a commitment device. One is the paired constraint process. The one is an idea of what to preclude and what to promote. You can elaborate on any of those that you want to, but first I want to ask, were you surprised by the various different ways that people found to like rein themselves in?
Yeah.
Different approaches?
Because again, that survey I mentioned where people think that we're most creative when we're most free, that was the most popular myth, and I would include myself in people who believed that before. So I was surprised. Like, it doesn't seem like you should need to box yourself in order to do anything, right? And again, the way humans have been modeled in economics and things like that for the most part is more choice should always be better, because that leads to you having more chance of making the optimal decision. But it turns out that that's just not how people work. That we don't have infinite computational ability, and our brains are not made for making the optimal choice anyway. And so we sort of need all of these like sometimes silly-seeming restrictions, both in order to make good decisions, be creative, and be more satisfied in our lives. I mean, some of the stuff, like the chapter on attention and focus, it seems like you should be able to just do it, right? Like you should just be able to pay attention when you want to, but it's not the case. Like, so if we really wanted to sort of optimize our And I feel like the term optimize has almost been like corrupted in a way that I don't like, so I'm hesitant to use it sometimes. But if we really were going to sort of, optimize the way that we work, then, so what we do naturally is we toggle between things at work. And that is a terrible way, actually, to optimize. But that's what we do left up to our own devices. So if you really want to be productive and less stressed, you have to put all these restrictions on yourself. So the chapter I wrote about focus was heavily based on the work of a psychologist named Gloria Mark. And when she started studying people at work 25 years ago, they were toggling between tasks about every 3 minutes on average. And then by 2012, it was every 75 seconds. And then by 2022, it was every 45 seconds. And it's stuck there for the last few years, so maybe that's where we are. But she found that an office worker on average, and she spent a ton of time tailing people at Microsoft too. She found that the average worker in an office checks email 77 times a day. Not 77 emails, 77 different checks where you toggle back from something else. And the number of toggles you make during the day, she describes the brain as a whiteboard, where when you switch tasks, you have to erase, but there's a residue left that builds up through the day that interferes with whatever you're doing next. And the number of switches someone did was a negative predictor of their productivity at the end of the day and a positive predictor of their stress as measured by heart rate variability. So multitasking or attempting to multitask, we can't really do it. It's actually just toggling, is really, really stressful. And she found the scariest thing in her research was that we get trained so that if you're responding to notifications and all this stuff all day, then if you say, well, today I'm really going to focus, you won't be able to. You will self-interrupt with intrusive thoughts at the rate to which you've become accustomed. So you've been trained as if you have this internal distraction barometer that will keep you going at a certain pace. So if you want to not have that, you have to retrain yourself, and it requires all these artificial limits, like what she calls batching, where can you answer those emails in, 5 different blocks where you're just doing that and not doing something else? And put a pad next to yourself when those intrusive thoughts come in, write it down what it is that you didn't check or whatever to get it out of your brain. So it really, this I did like crazy. So it really requires you structuring your own attention in these ways that seem kind of silly, because you should just be able to intuitively know the best workflow, but you don't. And there is an army of people on the other side of all your algorithms trying to engineer your attention, right? So if you're not structuring your attention, it's being structured for you.
Yeah, and also when it comes to that residue that you talked about, when you're toggling between, you point out that it's even if you read something terrible in the news and then you're like, okay, put the phone away, what am I doing here? That residue is like the trauma of it and all that stuff is also in the background of whatever you're doing.
And that's why it's even worse, right? Because we know a lot of these algorithms are trying to give you emotionally resonant content that usually has like a negative emotional resonance, because people tend to engage with that more. And things that are emotionally charged really interfere with your ability to switch back to whatever you were doing. So it's good to take breaks sometimes. You don't want to try to focus the whole day on end. Because your attention's like a bucket, and you actually want to take a break before the bucket overflows. But reading like the most horrific thing in the news is not a great way to do that. Maya Angelou when she was famously focused, where she would go to hotel rooms and have them take even the art off the wall so she wouldn't be distracted. But she would also bring, little things like crossword puzzles or whatever to take her own breaks, where she called it toggling between her big mind and her little mind. So I'd say she was ahead of the neuroscientists on that one.
Yeah, I love that. Well, since let's talk about maximizing, because I feel like that's been in the news a lot lately. We're talking about limiting our scope, being more inside the box, but then, of course, what we read about in the paper are all these people who are trying to maximize their life, do things bigger, do things better, do them more efficiently in every facet, from like working out to eating to like working, all this stuff. But what is the effect of that maximizing behavior?
Yeah, and I should say, by the way, even though we know a lot of that stuff is fake, like what we're seeing, it still affects people, even if you kind of know intellectually that it's fake. Maximizing, so one of the most important thinkers in this book is this guy, Herbert Simon. Can I go into the background a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Is Herbert Simon, who was trained as a political scientist, but he won the highest awards in computer science because he co-created the first AI demonstration. He won the highest award in psychology, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And one of his important findings was that humans are not the way that we are represented in economic models, where we can optimize decisions because we have limited ability to understand our choices and predict the future and all these things. And so we have to come up with sort of good enough shortcuts for rules. And what he argued was that we should do that very proactively, what he called satisficing, which is a portmanteau of satisfy and suffice. And there was this problem that he was aware of called Fredkin's paradox, where we spend the most time on the least important decisions because it's when we're having trouble evaluating between different options that we spend a lot of time and energy, but that we're probably having trouble because the difference doesn't really matter that much, or we can't figure it out. And so Simon simplified his life. He said, you should have good enough rules for decisions, and once they're met, move on. So he had one type of beret he wore and one type of socks, and he said you need 3 pairs of clothes, one on your body, one in the closet, and one in the wash. And he ate the same breakfast every day, and he lived in the same house for 46 years. And he was consciously trying to save cognitive energy for the things that really mattered, like for his work. Because what he argued was that if you took into account the cost and energy of agonizing over trying to optimize all your decisions or maximize, you would see that satisficing really is the maximizing strategy. And after he passed away in 2001, researchers who followed up on his work found that this is quite true, where they created a satisficer-maximizer scale. So it's how much are you the type of person who is sort of always looking for the best, right? Like, you can't just settle for that broom that seems to fit your needs on Amazon. You have to read like all the other reviews, just see what else is out there. You like this Netflix show, but there might be something better. If you have those kind of tendencies, you might be more of a maximizer. And it turns out that it's almost always bad to be a maximizer. Maximizers are less happy with their decisions. They're less happy with their lives, much more prone to regret, more likely to opt for reversible decisions, even though it makes them less likely to commit at all, and makes them more unhappy. And so nobody's a satisficer or maximizer in all things, by the way. But I think with this kind of influencer culture of maximizing everything, it's really important for people to set their own satisficing rules for things, like decide ahead of time what is good enough for me on this, and then go with it to not be a crazy person. Satisficers there's not much evidence that they actually make worse decisions, and they're much happier. So I don't think it's a case of just having low standards. I mean, Herb Simon called himself an incorrigible satisficer, and he won the highest award in a number of academic disciplines. So I don't think it's just a low standards thing.
Yeah, but it is kind of recognizing that we have we only have a certain level of attention span toward anything. And
yeah.
What are we going to spend it on?
And it's a cost, spending that energy, right? It's a cost. But it's tough because there's so many. I keep thinking this. It's never been easier to do too much. And I think that goes for everything from our decisions to, and I think AI only exacerbates that issue, right? Where it removes the boundaries. It removes you having to do the hard work of deciding what's not worth doing. Like there's an infinite capacity to start things that you're never going to finish or that may not be worthwhile at all. So it's a tough spot that we're in.
It is tough. Okay, I'm going to turn to you guys in 4 minutes after this next question, so get your questions ready. So we've been talking a lot about the benefits of boxing ourselves in. But there is a limit to you can take it too far. Can
yeah.
you not? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so to go to one of the basic things, like when I was reading these studies of creativity, if people are basically told, if you put someone in a situation and they say, could I still surprise myself? And the answer is no, they're way too constrained. Like if you tell them what to do and how to do it, in a nutshell, that's not good. People, don't feel agency, and their creativity drops. So there's no question that you can be too constrained. That said, I think even sort of thought experiments about what would seem too constraining can be useful to do. Mm-hmm. There was one of the first readers of the book was this guy named Ed Hoffman, who was the chief knowledge officer at NASA. It's kind of like a psychologist who's in charge of making sure the organization learns lessons from their mistakes. And he said, I got to tell you about this mission called L-Cross, where the team ended up with half the time and money they expected to have and said, it's impossible. We can't do this. And then they said, well, if we were going to get it done, how would we do it? And they said, well, we can't build from scratch. So they borrowed imaging equipment from Army tanks and engine temperature sensors right out of NASCAR and built a probe that confirmed water on the moon. Now, had they been constrained to a quarter of the time and budget, would they have been able to do that? I doubt it. Mm-hmm. But that exercise led them to this whole new philosophy of borrowing technology. So I think even the thought experiment can be useful.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more thing, just because we were talking about it in the green room, and we have to pose this question to the audience. But one of the things that I found so fascinating in this book was he talks about the creative process of the writer Isabella Allende and the rules that she puts on herself. Can you explain what those rules are, and then we'll give everyone their assignment?
Okay. Yeah, so Isabella Allende, one of the greatest living writers. She started writing around the age of 40, and now she's almost 84, and since then has produced a best-selling book about every 18 months on average. 80 million copies in all. And she's given a huge amount of the money away to her foundation, tens of millions of dollars. And she started writing her first book on January 8th when she was in exile from Chile. And she has started every January 8th since then. If she's finished with the previous book, she has started another book. So she has this incredible seasonality to her life where what she calls her life turned outward ends on January 7th, and she kind of retreats into this space of silence and structure and discipline. Like, she has all these rituals. She lights a candle to start her workday and blows it out at the end. All these rituals that signal to her what and when she's doing what she's doing. And it also lets other people in her life now know that if they need something from her, better get to it before January 7th, and then they have to leave her alone. And I thought she was especially interesting, not only because obviously I'm going to use any excuse I can to shadow one of the greatest people in my profession, but because she's also done amazing nonfiction work. But when there are profiles of her, I think because her first book, which was a blockbuster, The House of the Spirits, which apparently has a new Amazon Prime series that's running like right now, she told me. She's often profiled as kind of mystical medium, again, as if she just like sits there and these characters speak through her. And I think she encourages that a little bit sometimes, but it's because she has this magical realism in her books, especially the first one. And the truth is that she's incredibly disciplined and structured. And it's not this like sitting back and channeling the story. The first few weeks, as she says, she's like getting in this mode of being sequestered. She doesn't even write anything she's going to keep most of the time. And she does a huge amount of research to set the stage for herself. So I thought it was a real contrast between how she's like portrayed as this like, you know, like a mystical medium versus this story is really, the features sound like this boundlessness, but really it's like her boundaries are what create her breakthroughs. And I offered her, like a little while ago, an advance copy of the book because she's in it. And she said, oh, yeah, send it, but I'm not going to read it because it was January 8th, as you know, recently, and I'm working on a book, so I can't do anything else. I said, perfect. Perfect answer. And then she just emailed me recently and said, I'm partway through the book. I'm loving it. You made this dry stuff really interesting, etc. And I was like, you shouldn't be reading my book. You should be writing a novel. And she wrote back and said, a few days ago, and said, well, this January 8th, I gave myself a limit. I said I was going to have a first draft by the end of March, which is very fast. And then she said, the reason why is not important, so there's something weird going on. I don't know what it is. I asked her if I could share her emails, by the way. So, and then she came up with, wait, hold on, let me just read the thing that because I can't remember exactly the thing. Sorry, I'm going to read Isabel's email here. Like I said, I asked first, just in case. Sorry, don't mind me while I'm searching my email. I had my phone on airplane, so we got to do a whole couple things here. Okay. Okay, so she said, yeah, I started the novel on January 8th, end of March. She said the reason's not important. My agent and my brother read it, liked it a lot, still needs polishing, but it's May. And I find myself without work until next January 8th. I'm going crazy. I'm getting rid of my clothes, replacing the furniture, walking in circles, reading compulsively, etc. Your book has been an inspiration. I need to give myself a task with boundaries. For example, write a novel set in Lima in the year 1610 about a cowardly Spanish soldier, an Inca maid, and the Inquisition. Or a story set in 1810 in Ireland about a girl/witch expelled from her village who seeks revenge, maybe in the style of Stephen King. You get the idea. I can't start writing until January 8th, but I can start researching and planning. I have total freedom to do whatever I want. And at my age, 84, I have no obligation to keep writing. This freedom is lethal. Help! Exclamation points. And then she sends a short message the next day. Do you have an idea for me? Not the Inca maid or the Irish witch. So, if anybody has an idea for Isabel's next novel, I told her I'd solicit some ideas and pass it along if we got anything good.
Yeah, so be thinking about that while you're
It's our assignment.
bringing us your questions. So like she said, you can line up here at the mic. I also have some here that you guys can enter by using that QR code. And I'm going to just ask one from here while we get going. What's your best advice for students today?
I would say not to start with ChatGPT when they're doing anything. It depends on the age of the students, of course, but I think that's a general one that probably crosses just about any age group, to start with their brain first, or else it's like using the GPS. You're not going to learn your way around. And when this comes to your brain learning how to do thinking in the world, you don't want to not know your way around.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's pause for a moment and take a quick break.
Want to spend a week in Rome with Katie and me at a time of year the city is less crowded, less hot, but just as wonderful as you imagine it? Now's your chance. The first week of November, this year, 2026, we are taking an intimate group of listeners to Rome for a week of beauty, discovery, and pleasure. After our 13 plus years hosting this podcast, which at least partially is about Rome and based in Rome, and my 20 plus years of working as a tour guide here, it's safe to say we know this city. And Rome is a city that is worth knowing well. It has so many incredible layers of history, art, and beauty to peel back, and we want to share that knowledge with you, our listeners, and maybe even inspire new passions that you will nurture and deepen long after our trip is over. The vast majority of people who come to Rome barely scratch the surface of what this city has to offer. And this trip is different. There are only 8 rooms available, and 4 of them are already gone. So if you'd like to claim a room or just chat with us about it, get in touch. You can email us at bittersweetlifepodcast@gmail.com, and one of us will get back to you personally to answer all your questions. Or you can visit our website, thebittersweetlife.net, to find any additional information. We can't wait to take you to Rome.
Go ahead.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Do you have any plan to use any of this research that you did to influence public policy, to help students or to help people make better decisions in government or anywhere else, similar to how the research in Nudge was used for school lunches and 401ks and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because obviously I view my role as the writer and put the ideas out there and hope that people in positions will find it useful. So I don't have a systematic plan other than I live in Washington, D.C., and when people involved in policy and things like that invite me to talk, I certainly go. And I share opinions based on my research, not based on, my own personal opinions. But there's a chapter that we haven't talked about because I think it's a little hard to talk about, actually, to be honest, in a succinct way, where I talk about the work of an economist named Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for his research on what he called institutions. And by institutions, he didn't mean colleges and hospitals. He meant the rules of the game for society, or as he called the constraints on human behavior that come from either social norms or political structures. And what he won the Nobel for was showing that, when he was studying, the paradigm was that all improvements in shared prosperity come from technological innovation. And what he showed was that actually these changes in social norms and political structures that start making strangers more predictable to one another, so they constrains their behavior in a way, so people start doing business outside of their kinship network or outside of their religious network, actually creates the markets that make innovation even worthwhile. And so as these institutions were actually the precursor to innovation. And what he, so trust among strangers that comes from these social norms and things like that is highly correlated to per capita GDP. And so he argued it was the foundation of shared prosperity, and that it involves constraints on oftentimes the most powerful members of society. And so he goes through like most of the world has legal systems from either France or Great Britain. And in Great Britain, legal systems were created to constrain the crown. And it actually led to more prosperity because then people were willing to lend money if they felt they'd get paid back. And in France, it was the local magnates wanting to constrain each other that sort of led to their legal systems. And so all of these systems that constrain the people with the most power and social norms that make people more trustworthy are the foundation of shared prosperity. And I think a lot of those are under attack, frankly. And what I just saw this Pew survey that showed that America is now the only country where a majority of adults, it was a small majority, but a majority of adults say that other people have bad morals. And that's exactly what North would have predicted if there was like a breakdown of shared social norms and undermining of institutions, and that's terrible for shared prosperity. And so if anybody will listen to me, I think I certainly want to, and by the way, and then it has long-run effects. Even after that stuff disappears, it has long-run effects on stranger trust. And so if anybody will listen to me, I'll certainly talk about like what I think are the long-run dangers of some of the things that are going on right now, as well as I think some of the ways that we're using technology, even in schools, will undermine students' ability to learn. So I think when there are areas that intersect with research I know about, I'm certainly happy to talk about it. But I do not have a systematic plan for going on any kind of...
No crusades for you?
No crusades. I talked about this stuff on my friend Pablo Torre's podcast a lot, so we were sort of harping on people. See, I don't know if people saw him. This is my closest friend from Sports Illustrated. He just won a Pulitzer for reporting on how Steve Ballmer, the Clippers owner, was like circumventing the NBA salary cap. And we spent the whole time talking about this stuff and talking about how important it is. Some people may see that story as not Pulitzer worthy because it's just basketball, but we need like some public corruption heads on spikes, because it is a terrible thing to see public corruption and know that people aren't being held to account. And when you start to realize that the rules don't apply, so the foundation of the modern economy is what's called impersonal rules, where rules apply not dependent on who you are as a person and who you know. When rules are personal, like they were in sort of tribal societies where everything depends on who you know, that's when you have like the breakdown of the foundation of the things that have given us all the stuff we have. So I really think that we need, we're suffering. There's like so much public corruption that's just thrown in our faces now. When I talk to my colleagues at ProPublica, if people heard of ProPublica here mostly? Okay. They'll be like, sometimes we're not even sure what to investigate because they're just announcing stuff that we would have spent a year investigating in the past, right? That's bad news. So... yeah, I'm happy to talk about these things, but I don't have a systematic plan for being other than a writer who talks about his research.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. In your research, was there any situations where constraints turned out to be a bad thing and having more choice was beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, in much of the world, there is too little choice. And for most of human history, the idea that we have too much choice would have been utterly laughable, right? Most of... everything was, people's existence was structured by rulers and religions, and that was basically it. And still in many parts of the world, people don't have a lot of choice. So those aspects of this book are, I think, written for an audience that is in certain parts of the world, basically. A lot of the U.S. primarily, but now you're seeing these surveys, they're just a little bit behind in China now, like these boredom surveys and discontent and stuff like that, so they're catching up with us. But there's a lot of work about how when people have a certain level of scarcity of certain types, people become like more creative and efficient. But then at like really deprivation levels of scarcity, it takes up so much of your cognitive bandwidth just trying to make it that you like can't do other important. It really like impairs your ability to think. There's an interesting book about this called Scarcity. If whoever asked that is interested in it, yeah.
Go ahead.
Hey, David.
Hi.
So I may be misinterpreting each of your last two books, but it occurs to me that there may be some ideas that are in conflict between range and inside the box, like range, like the idea that concentrating too early is a problem, concentrating too heavily is a problem. Yeah. Like, you should be open to ideas coming from other places is central to like peak performance, whereas inside the box, it's like too much openness can also, get in the way of peak performance. So I'm curious, like, how I should think about this in a way that they're not in conflict.
Yeah, I mean, to me, inside the box felt like the natural next question. So it was partly responsive to the most common question that I got from readers, where it would often be something along the lines of, okay, I've got these broad experiences or broad tool set, now what? Like, I'm so curious, I'm not really sure what to do. And I put myself in that boat big time. Like, there's a reason it's been 7 years between all my books, is because I'm really curious and I do have trouble deciding, not coming up with ideas, but deciding what to execute on and then how to execute. And so it felt to me like the natural next step, and that these things are always a balance. So there's this big famous body of research that first started in organizational behavior about what's called the explore-exploit trade-off, where explore is, and this research started in looking at companies where they're doing R&D or they're trying to find new things or new solutions, and then once they find something that works, they drill down and exploit the value of that. And then eventually it expanded to individuals. So there was a study led by Dashan Wong at Northwestern a little while ago where he looked at tens of thousands of different careers in various fields, and he found that most people produce their best work in a hot streak, so sequentially. And some people have 2, most people have 1, some people have none. And what reliably preceded a hot streak was a period of exploration where you were sort of so you would, for the scientists, for example, you'd see them working in small teams doing lots of like little things, and then when they find something really interesting, then they drill into it and keep. And the pattern for successful long-term organizations and individuals was toggling between explore and exploit. Like learning new stuff, seeing what's out there, finding a thing and drilling in on it. And then when you extract a lot of that value, it's like going back to it. And so to me, I sort of viewed this as my explore and exploit books, sort of following that, of building that broad tool set, which I think is increasingly important in a fast-changing world. But it can, at some point, you have to channel that into something. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to start the book with Dmitry Mendeleev, who discovered the periodic table, too, because he was this incredible polymath. But it took this sort of very narrow frame and problem to channel that into this big achievement. So. But also, I should be honest that I just think like the world's messy, and once I examine one side of a coin, I also like want to go look at the other and see what's there, basically. So yeah, some of that too. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Is there anything that you discovered in researching this book that didn't make it in that you would want to share?
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff because again, I did this. It's my shortest book.
Right.
I mean,
constrained.
Yeah, and you know As a writer I loved at Sports Illustrated counseled me when I was younger, the readers don't know what isn't there. He was telling me that's how you have to be okay with cuts. And there were a lot of stories that I really liked that got cut. For example, like Southwest Airlines, which I think was an interesting company. And still is maybe, but I don't know that much about its recent history, but I know its earlier history that I read a lot in was very interesting. And when they started, they had like 4 destinations in Texas, basically, or routes. And let's see if I get this right, since it didn't go in the book, it didn't end up going through fact checking. But they had like $140 left in the bank, like really early in their existence. And decided that the only way they could make payroll was selling one of their 4 planes, but that would also doom the company. And so one of the heads of ground operations did sort of a calculation and said, well, we could still serve all the routes with 3 planes if we can turn a plane around in 10 minutes. So he went to the company and said, well, you guys are going to figure out how to turn a plane around in 10 minutes or we're all fired because there's no company. And they ended up, pilots started helping clean the cabin, and they lined people up to come in one door while others was going out another door, and they started turning around planes in 10 minutes. And that started successive quarters of profitability that didn't end until the pandemic. I thought that was a cool story. There's one that journalists calls drowning your kittens or killing your babies, all these like very aggressive terms for cutting things that you like.
Kill your darlings.
Kill your darlings. I really missed a Steve Jobs story about when he because I ended up, because I wrote about Pixar in the book quite a bit and about General Magic, I ended up even though I wasn't trying to report about Steve Jobs, I ended up interviewing a lot of people who used to work with him. And what a lot of them seemed to say was that he was kind of micromanaging early on, and then when he had these years in the wilderness where he got kicked out of Apple, and then he came back and was much less micromanaging and was more like, I'm setting the problem, and then I'm going to, have my people, give them freedom to solve it. But when he came back, Apple was a mess. Like, it was going to die. And they were making like servers and printers and this thing called the Newton, and they had 1 million different computer models. And he said, this is so complex. It's like steals all the clarity from what we're doing. So he drew a 2x2 grid, and it said, consumer and pro, desktop and portable. We're going to have 4 products, period, and canceled everything else. And people were upset, but it gave them a lot of clarity of what to focus on. So I really enjoyed, there were a lot of stories that I liked that ended up having to cut. Maybe I'll find some other place to use them.
Next book.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you, let's see, 2 more. How can constraints help us maintain curiosity?
So I think because in some ways, right, those can seem like they're in conflict in a certain way, but there's a little research late in the book about the importance of question framing and what's called specific curiosity, where when people are forced to think through a narrow puzzle, they will start doing what these researchers called idea linking, where it doesn't really matter what the puzzle is. If it's pretty specific and they get interested in it, they'll start jumping from idea to idea and may land very far from where they started. So let's take me, for example. So the opening story of the book is about the discovery of the periodic table and what Matthew Walker in his best-selling book, Why We Sleep, got wrong. And the way I came to that was I learned a certain story in college chemistry, had no reason to doubt it, and then one day I was reading something in New Scientist and was wondering why the symbol for tungsten is a W. And so I started looking it up, and it turns out it's because it's from a German word. And then I'm wondering, well, how do elements get named? And then I realized there's an element named Mendelevium. How did that get named? I started reading about Dmitri Mendeleev, discovered the periodic table. And one thing leads to another, and then I learned that this story that I learned in college chemistry is completely wrong about how the periodic table was created. And so it's like having a curiosity about one thing, if it's very specific, leads you on these like stepping stone trail. So I think finding a specific question so when I'm with my 7-year-old now, instead of just sort of laying things out, I'll address like a very specific question with him, and it almost doesn't matter what it is because it just kind of gets him going, and then we jump from one thing to another. So I think using that specific, and in these studies they showed that if the researchers could induce specific curiosity in someone, where they would do these exercises where they kind of they would tell people their answers about things were like close but a little wrong, and that induces them to start searching, and they would show that they would start doing more creative things even the next day. So I think finding narrow puzzles that you can drill into will lead to new ideas in many cases.
Okay, and finally, with comparison being the thief of joy, how, if possible, can constraints help us decrease comparison and possibly increase compassion?
I think the easiest one for decreasing comparison is to spend less time on social media, right? Like, put a time limit on your social media, use the app, because that's this huge engine of comparison, and so much of it is unreal also. And I think grounding yourself in reality is probably helpful. My favorite website is one called Our World in Data. It's these Oxford researchers who all they do is take public data and turn it into visualizations and articles. And it gives you a good sense of the world not being what it looks like on the internet. But I would just spend a lot less time on social media. Not that there's not some good stuff on there, but it's such a comparison engine. And I, for myself, developed the last chapter is a little more philosophical, and I think it's important to consolidate your caring, basically. There's so many things that the internet wants you to care about, and it's overwhelming. So if you can come up with like a few values you're committed to, what philosophers call narrative values, that are themes in your story, when you look back in your story that are there. For me, things like open-mindedness, curiosity, diligence, and say, these are the values. I'm going to worry about these and things in the world, and just realize you can't worry about everything else. They can be kind of a North Star in an overwhelming world if you can articulate those things to yourself. And coming up with satisficing, with good enough standards for things. I think it's really, really important. I have maximizing tendencies, so this is not a natural thing for me. Like when I see someone optimizing, like I want to
want in.
It's attractive, yeah. So I have to fight my own natural tendencies. So my newsletter, for example, this isn't going to make anybody want to read it, but very consciously is a satisficing exercise for me, where I say if a book has to be a 9 or a 10, if I hit 6.5 on a newsletter post, I'm sending it out. There's always more stuff I want to add. But after doing that for 2 years, I now feel like it's okay, where it felt bad at first. So I think having a satisficing exercise in your life can be really important. And this goes back to range a little bit, but diversifying your identity too. Like hobbies that are unrelated to your work are super good for people. You don't have to be good at it. It doesn't matter. But identity is like a house, and you don't want to be spending all your time in one room. Because when things aren't going well in that room, you want to be able to go to another room. So have a hobby. It's shown that if people have hobbies that are unrelated to their work, it improves their sense of well-being and resilience and things like that. So that's not about inside the box. That's more of a range thing. But I'm now very pro hobby that's not related to your work.
That's great. What's your hobby?
I dance.
Oh, very
I mean,
nice.
I've always been a big runner, but dancing is the thing that I picked up more newly. I like learning a new physical skill kind of every year. But yeah, that's my latest one. So I go to like dance meetups.
That's great. That's great. Well, you can buy the book over there. He's going to be signing over there. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. Oh, there is one more. Come on up here real quick.
I'll be quick. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see there.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I'm Chilean myself, so I'm quite impressed that you have contact with Isabel Allende. My question would be if there's a constraint that you see repeated amongst the greatest humans, the greatest talents.
Is there a constraint you see among the greatest humans?
Among the greatest humans, wow, that's
Question.
That's an interesting question. Who are the greatest humans?
It's a good
I have to
question.
think about
there.
that first.
Well, maybe you'd have to limit yourself to the people that you actually researched.
I mean, I do think, I have to think about who I even think are the greatest humans, but
LeBron James?
certainly one of the great, I mean, I think I like him a lot. I think a lot of because I'm thinking not just about this book, but in general, but also about this book, that a lot of the people who've done really great things, at least, are often really good at really low stakes practice and trial and error. Like they find ways to do things in a really low stakes way. So like when I was writing about Pixar here, so I think Ed Catmull is an amazing guy who's one of the co-founders. He would force people to stay as small as possible, as long as possible, because their trial and error and things are they're low cost and low risk when you stay small. And I think that's true of a lot of people I admire, where they find ways to do things in a low stakes environment while they're learning about themselves and developing, instead of kind of going the general magic route and going straight from big vision to trying to do huge things. They find places to sort of experiment, whether that's someone who's trying to make a difference in politics, where they're often starting at sort of more of a grassroots way and testing, or someone who's creating technology and doing it in a small way. So I think finding those places for low stakes practice. And I think that's just important personally too. When I got into journal, I'm a more introverted person. Maybe it doesn't seem so from how I'm rambling, but I really did not like talking to strangers when I shifted from science into journalism. And so I started forcing myself to strike up conversation in elevators with people, which is great low-stakes practice, because a minute later, they're gone no matter what happens, right? So I think, and I've noticed that just in a lot of people who've done really interesting things, is they find a way to be in an environment where you can kind of fail and try stuff, and it's not a disaster.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, David, for
Thank you.
coming to Seattle.
Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. All right. I hope you enjoyed listening to that interview with David Epstein and his book, Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. If you really enjoyed it, if you learned something, if there's something in there you felt like you should pass along, share this show with a friend. Send it to them by email, send it to them on social media, make a post, help us spread the word. And if you send me an email letting me know that you sent this to at least 5 people, I'll put you in the running to win a copy of this book. I will trust you. I will send the book to you on my own dime. And all it takes is for you to spread the word, share the Bittersweet Life with 5 of your friends, and send us an email. And you'll get your own hardcover copy of this book if you win our drawing. Send the email to bittersweetlifepodcast@gmail.com. That's bittersweetlifepodcast@gmail.com. Share the show with 5 people. Let me know that you did, and I'll put you in the hat to win a copy of this book. And until next time, this is The Bittersweet Life. I'm Katie Sewell. Talk to you next week. Bye. You could sponsor this show and reach educated, curious, and compassionate listeners all over the world. Visit thebittersweetlife.net and click support to get the conversation started.